My name is Harper. Have you ever lived with a secret so big it turned you into someone you didn't recognize anymore? The story I'm about to tell might be the craziest thing I've ever been through. This is my secret. I don't know what made me jump out of my chair by the fireplace and run outside into the freezing cold that night. My feet seemed to know the way on their own, taking me straight to the small barn behind the house, where Oscar, the capuchin monkey I always considered my closest friend, was fast asleep after a long day of climbing around the garden trees. The winter wind howled through the pine branches, so cold it felt like it could cut through my skin. But I didn't care. I was colder on the inside. The lantern outside the barn swayed in the wind, casting a dim yellow glow against the weathered wooden walls. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. Oscar was curled up in his little nest. When I softly called his name, his large, round eyes blinked open, gleaming in the darkness. He tilted his head at me as if to ask, "Why are you here at this hour?" I gave a sad smile and sat down beside him. "I couldn't sleep, Oscar," I whispered, my voice trembling in the stillness. Oscar leapt down from his perch and climbed onto my shoulder, the way he always did when he wanted to comfort me. I stroked his soft fur, feeling the warmth of his small body seep into my fingertips. A strange sense of peace settled over me, but with it came an invisible fear. I knew I shouldn't be seeking this kind of deep solace from a creature that couldn't speak. I closed my eyes and murmured, "You understand me, don't you?" "More than he does." Oscar let out a quiet sound, almost like an answer, and for that brief moment I didn't feel alone anymore. But then, the sound of footsteps on the frozen ground made me freeze. I turned my head and felt my breath catch in my throat. Someone was standing at the barn door. It was Grace, the animal trainer who always seemed to look right through me as if she could read my soul. Her gaze was sharp, full of unspoken questions and warnings. My throat tightened. I knew everything had changed. Grace stood there, her piercing eyes cutting through the silence. She didn't speak right away, just stared at me and Oscar with a look that said she already understood everything. That silence made the air in the barn feel thick and heavy. I must look ridiculous, don't I? I forced out a shaky smile, but my voice cracked like shattered glass. Grace slowly stepped inside, closing the door behind her to block out the cold wind. "Harper," she said, her voice low and deliberate, as though she was carefully choosing each word. "Do you understand what you're doing?" My chest tightened. Oscar clung to my shoulder, his tiny fingers gripping my coat like the last lifeline tethering me to sanity. I stopped, realizing I had no reasonable explanation for what I was doing. The way Oscar comforted me wasn't wrong, but the attachment I had to him, I knew it had crossed a line. "You don't need to explain to me," Grace said, her tone softening but still razor-sharp. "But you need to be honest with yourself. This isn't really about Oscar, is it?" I lowered my head, feeling like she had plunged a knife of truth straight into my heart, a truth I had avoided for so long. The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. "I'm tired, Grace. I'm so lonely." Grace stepped closer, and this time her eyes held something else, understanding. "I know," she said gently, "but Harper, seeking comfort from something that can't give you real love in return, it's only going to make you feel more lost." I hugged Oscar tighter, as if letting him go would make me fall apart completely. But deep down, I knew she was right. Those fleeting moments of peace with him were nothing more than an escape. I had built an island around myself to avoid facing the truth about my marriage that was already unraveling. Suddenly, the bright beams of headlights shone through the barn door cracks. I froze. The familiar rumble of an engine made my heart stop. Daniel was home. I peered out the small window and saw his tall figure stepping out of the car. The headlights illuminated the narrow path leading to the barn, his shadow stretching long in the dark. He paused for a moment as if sensing that something wasn't right before walking toward the barn with slow, steady steps. "Harper?" His voice was calm and familiar, but there was an edge of uncertainty. "Are you in there?" I looked at Grace and she gave me a slight nod, a silent reminder. It's time to face the truth. I took a deep breath and set Oscar down on the ground, even though he clung to my hand with soft, pleading sounds. I stepped out of the shadows and faced Daniel, his eyes fixed intently on me, reading every expression on my face. "You're out here in the middle of the night. Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. I knew this was the moment of truth. Either I continued to run away as I always had, or I admitted everything I'd been feeling for so long. I caught a glimpse of Grace standing silently behind me, like a quiet observer waiting to see which path I'd choose. "Daniel." My voice cracked, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I need to tell you something." He stayed still, not interrupting, his gaze steady with a mix of patience and apprehension. "I feel lonely. In our home," I said, my voice trembling but no longer hiding. "I've tried everything to stop feeling this way. But I'm lost, Daniel. I feel like I'm disappearing." He remained silent, his eyes widening slightly as though he was trying to absorb the weight of my words. After what felt like an eternity, he sighed, letting his hands fall to his sides. "Harper, do you still love me?" That question hit me like an arrow to the heart. I lowered my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know anymore," I sobbed, "but I want to find it again. If we still can." The air in the barn grew impossibly still. Grace turned and quietly stepped outside, leaving the space for just the two of us. Daniel moved closer to me, his hands hovering for a moment before he gently placed them on my shoulders. "I've been lost too," he whispered, "but if you're willing to try, I'll be here." I looked up at him through my tears. His eyes, though weary, held a flicker of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Oscar leapt onto a nearby branch, watching us intently, his wide eyes gleaming as if he understood everything. I wiped my tears away, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the barn with Daniel, leaving behind the place that had become my sanctuary from the truth. The night air was cold, but inside me there was the faintest glow, a small beginning of something new. Daniel stood before me, the dim yellow light casting a soft glow over his face. I could feel his warm breath mingling with the cold air. We were so close that if I took just one more step, I'd be in his arms. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Harper." His voice was deep, raw, filled with a vulnerability I'd never heard before. His eyes were no longer distant or guarded. They were full of understanding and the pain he'd been hiding all along. "I'm sorry for leaving you alone." I felt my whole body tremble at his words. The cracks I'd buried deep within me began to split wide open. Memories of the loneliness and silence came rushing back like a tidal wave. I looked into his eyes, the place I used to seek comfort but hadn't found in so long. "I waited for you, Daniel," I whispered, my voice distant, like it belonged to someone else. "But you weren't there when I needed you." I didn't know who moved first, me or him, but suddenly the distance between us was gone, his arms wrapped around me, holding me tightly as if he could somehow make up for all the years of absence. His lips brushed gently against my hair, a silent apology that words could never capture. I tilted my face up, and our eyes met in a moment thick with emotion. The walls of reason I had built around my heart began to crumble. I knew I shouldn't let myself give in. I knew that one kiss would shatter everything I had tried to hold together. But in that moment, I couldn't resist anymore. Our lips found each other, hesitant at first, then urgent and fierce. His breath mingled with mine, melting the frost that had settled in my soul. His arms held me, firm yet tender, as if he was afraid I'd disappear if he let go. Every touch deepened the closeness between us. His hands traced down my arms, caressing me as though he wanted to memorize every second of this moment. I let go of every barrier, every fear, and let my heart lead me. My skin shivered under the warmth of his touch, every movement speaking volumes in the quiet of the night. The barn felt like it had transformed into a world of our own, a place where the cracks of the past and the locked doors of silence didn't exist. There was just us, two people desperate to find what they'd lost. Harper. Daniel whispered my name between shallow breaths, but this time there was no distance in his voice. I clung to him tighter, as if silently promising that I was still here, that there was still a chance for both of us to heal. But in that very moment, I realized I had crossed a line I'd once sworn I wouldn't cross unless I was truly ready. This wasn't just about physical closeness, it was my heart finally surrendering. I closed my eyes, feeling the warmth and tenderness of the man I once loved so deeply it almost drove me mad. But at the same time, a voice echoed in my mind. Will this bring us back together or push us further apart? Daniel's breath lingered close to me, his heartbeat pounding against my chest, a vivid reminder that he was really here, though it felt impossible. His fingers brushed gently against my cheek, wiping away the tears that still clung there. I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his familiar touch, though now it carried an entirely different meaning. Every ounce of reason in me seemed to dissolve. No more warnings from Grace, no more fears about tomorrow or the consequences. There was only this moment where I could finally be myself, fragile, yet honest. Daniel leaned in, and his lips found mine again, this time soft but profound, as though he was imprinting this moment deep into his memory. My breaths grew more ragged as his closeness seeped into every part of me, making reality fade away. I knew I was stepping over a delicate boundary, but my heart screamed, refusing to let me pull back. The loneliness had gnawed at me for too long, and his warmth felt like a wildfire blazing through the storm inside me. I couldn't resist its pull, like a wanderer in the desert finding cool water after a lifetime of thirst. I'm here. I won't leave you alone again, Daniel whispered, his voice a solemn vow tinged with regret. I tightened my arms around his neck, unwilling to let go, unwilling to let this moment slip away like a dream. Every gesture of his felt like a reassurance that I was still loved, still worthy. But at the same time, I felt overwhelmed, unsure if I was seeking salvation or sinking deeper into something I couldn't control. The world seemed to still around us, filled only with shallow breaths and the synchronized rhythm of our hearts. I could hear the creak of the wooden beams in the small barn and the wind whistling through the gaps, but they all faded into a dull hum in the background. Then, suddenly, a sound broke through, the unmistakable noise of an engine stopping in front of the house. I blinked, my breath catching in my chest. Daniel froze too. He didn't need to turn around, I already knew who had arrived. The headlights beamed through the slats of the barn door, casting our shadows onto the wooden wall. A third shadow appeared, sharp and unmistakable. I turned and saw Grace standing there, her eyes wide with disbelief. The bright light caught in her gaze, making her brown eyes burn like twin flames. The tension in the air thickened until it felt impossible to breathe. Harper. Grace's voice cut through the silence like a cold, precise blade. Do you realize what you've just done? Her words were like a bell ringing me awake. The moments we had just shared pieced together in my mind like fragments forming a complete picture. I let go of Daniel, stepping back a little, though my trembling hand still hovered near him, reluctant to lose his warmth. Grace, I whispered, but my voice was barely more than a ragged breath. Grace stepped further inside, shutting the door behind her. How do you think you're going to escape this? Her voice wasn't harsh, rather it was the final warning of someone who cared but couldn't stay silent any longer. Daniel turned to face her, his expression still heavy with emotion but now tinged with realization. The small room suddenly felt suffocating, overloaded with everything we'd kept buried for too long. Harper, what's happening? Daniel asked, his voice trembling more with fear than anger. I don't understand. I turned to look at him, and the tears that had stopped briefly began falling again. I knew this was it, the moment I had to choose, confront everything or run away. My heart ached as though it were being twisted apart, but my fragile reasoning whispered that this moment would define everything, truth or deceit. There was no turning back now. Daniel stood there, reaching out his hand as if to pull me back, but his eyes were filled with confusion and pain. That look crushed me. And Grace. She stood motionless, an uninvited witness, carrying the harsh weight of the truth I couldn't hide anymore. I felt as though I was standing at a crossroads, one path leading me back to the familiar reality I'd known, scarred and lonely as it was, and the other leading me further into the emotional abyss I had just plunged into. My hand clenched at the empty air, as if mourning something precious I had just lost. The sweetness of being in Daniel's arms still lingered around me, like a haunting echo that refused to fade. Daniel stepped closer, desperation softening his voice. "Harper, please just tell me what's going on." His voice wasn't firm like before. It trembled, almost pleading. That made it hurt even more. I had waited for this kind of vulnerability from him for so long, but now that he was standing before me, wide open, I couldn't bear the weight of his gaze. "I just wanted to feel loved, Daniel," I broke down, tears tearing through the walls I had built around myself for so many years. "I just wanted to feel like I mattered. To you." Daniel froze, as if every word I said was a blow he didn't know how to withstand. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, unable to find the words. I saw everything. Grace's voice cut through the emotions, sharp and deliberate. She stepped closer, her eyes still sharp, but this time they held a tinge of sadness. "Harper, you must know. This path doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to destruction. And you know that." It felt like the ground beneath my feet had given way. Grace's words were too precise, like a mirror reflecting the truth I had tried to ignore. Yes, I knew that. But even so, in Daniel's arms, I'd felt a fleeting happiness so intense that I had forgotten who I was. I took a step back, my eyes finding Daniel's once more. This time, the confusion in his gaze had shifted into something far more painful. Disappointment. "Harper, you've changed," he said, his voice unraveling in the quiet of the night. "But not because of you, because we lost each other a long time ago." Every word he said sliced through me like a razor-sharp blade. He was right, and that made it hurt even more. Daniel wasn't angry at me like I had feared. He wasn't blaming me. He just stood there, looking at me with the eyes of a man who had lost the most important thing in his life and knew there was no way to get it back. Grace remained silent, as if there was nothing more to say. She didn't need to say anything else. My mind had awakened amidst the storm tearing through my heart. I took a deep breath, though my chest felt like it was being crushed. "Daniel, I don't know what we're supposed to do next," I admitted, my voice trembling, stripped of the strength I had just moments ago. "But I don't want to live like this anymore, pretending everything is fine when it's not." Daniel's eyes weighed heavy on me, and after a long pause he gave me a slow, sorrowful nod. "I understand." He turned away, each step on the ground echoing like a farewell. I stood there motionless, watching him walk out into the light of the car's headlights. The car door closed with a final thud, and then the engine roared to life. The headlights lit my face one last time before they disappeared into the darkness. I turned back to Grace, who was still watching me with her steady, observant gaze. But this time, there was a quiet empathy there too. "You did the right thing," she said softly. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked over to Oscar, the little monkey who was still watching me from a nearby branch, his wide, glistening eyes silently asking, "What happens next?" I ran my fingers through his soft fur, a small gesture that reminded me of the part of me that still remained, the part of me that wanted to find myself again. Outside, the night was silent and cold, like a reminder that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. But amidst all the confusion and pain, I felt a small flicker of something else, something new. I stepped out of the barn, and for the first time in years, I wasn't running away from myself. Time seemed to freeze after Daniel left. Darkness blanketed the yard, the moonlight filtering through the branches in a pale glow. I stood there for what felt like forever, my body drained of strength, my mind spinning with the weight of everything that had happened. "Are you okay?" Grace's voice was soft, almost like a breeze. I didn't answer right away. I only nodded quietly, my eyes still locked on the empty space where Daniel had been. My thoughts tangled with unanswered questions. The closeness we had shared still burned like a slow flame in my chest, making my heart ache and yearn all at once. "You should go inside." Grace's voice was no longer sharp, it was filled with genuine concern. I turned and met her eyes, eyes that didn't judge but didn't hide their understanding either. I felt a strange sense of shame, as though she could see every unspoken thought I'd ever had. I pressed my lips together, drawing in a shaky breath, and stepped out of the barn. In the days that followed, the house became unbearably quiet. Daniel didn't come back right away, and in that big, empty space, every corner seemed to echo with memories. When I stood in front of the mirror in the living room, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. Her eyes were full of regret, shame, and a lingering sense of vulnerability. I walked down the hall, my feet moving as if on their own, leading me toward the window in the living room. I pulled back the curtain and stared out at the road, the same road Daniel had driven away on that night. My heart clenched every time I remembered the look in his eyes at that moment. Not anger, but a profound sadness and helplessness. And as I watched the empty road, I wondered if either of us would ever find our way back to each other, or if we were already too far gone. The next afternoon, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. As I approached the small barn, Oscar leapt down from a branch, his tiny hands clutching my sleeve as if to greet me. I let out a brief laugh, though it barely lingered. I gently patted Oscar's head and sat down by the tree next to the barn. A cool breeze drifted through the air, but I still felt a chill deep inside. Grace appeared in the distance carrying a small cloth bag of treats for Oscar. When she reached me, she placed the bag down and sat beside me. "What do you plan to do next?" she asked, her eyes meeting mine with calm sincerity. I sighed, staring at the endless Montana sky. "I don't know. Every time I think about Daniel, I feel both strong and unbearably weak." Grace stayed silent for a moment as though carefully considering her words before speaking. "You don't need to have all the answers right now, Harper. But you do need to be honest with yourself about what you want from this relationship." I turned to face her, our eyes meeting. In Grace's steady gaze, I saw nothing but honesty and understanding. I knew she was right, but the hardest part was confronting the truth I had avoided for so long. "Will he come back?" I asked, my voice small, more like a confession than a question. Grace gave a bittersweet smile. "That's something both of you have to figure out for yourselves." I lowered my head, the weight in my chest heavy but somehow clearer than before. The lingering awkwardness and confusion between Daniel and me still haunted me like scars that refused to fade. But now I knew I couldn't keep running from my feelings forever. That night, I sat on the front porch, gazing up at the vast Montana sky, its stars glittering like scattered diamonds. I exhaled slowly, letting the cold wind carry away some of the chaos inside me. I didn't know where Daniel was or what he was thinking, but I believed that in the end, it wasn't his forgiveness I needed most. It was my own. I sat there under the night sky, the chill of Montana's air seeping through my coat. But I didn't move. Inside, my raw emotions still burned like embers in a dying fire. I knew everything had crossed a line, and the closeness I had craved with Daniel wasn't the solution to my loneliness. It had been a fleeting blaze pushing me to the edge between love and ruin. Oscar climbed onto my lap and curled into a small ball, like a child seeking comfort. I ran my hand gently over his soft fur, my gaze fixed on the vast, empty darkness. But this time, instead of hiding, I listened to the voice inside me, the one that had whispered for so long. Harper, it's time to end this. The next morning I made up my mind. No more waiting, no more hesitation. I sat at the wooden kitchen table where breakfast for two had once filled the room with warmth and chatter when everything had still felt whole. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the phone, but I forced myself to be strong. I dialed and listened as the ringing echoed in my ear. "This is Daniel," he answered, his voice low, weary, and painfully familiar. "Daniel, we need to talk." I tried to keep my voice steady, though I knew he could hear the weight behind my words. He was silent for a long moment before replying. "I think so too." That afternoon, Daniel came back. His car pulled into the driveway, and I was already sitting on the porch waiting. As he stepped out, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as if he was bracing himself for the worst. But instead of accusations or anger, I looked at him and said, "We need to be honest with each other." He nodded, his eyes clouded with exhaustion from too many sleepless nights. "I'm here to listen." We sat in the living room, no longer separated by physical distance, yet still divided by the invisible wall that had been built over the years. I took a deep breath and began. "Daniel, I let myself fall into the depths of loneliness. I reached for things I thought I needed. But I was wrong. I crossed a line I never thought I'd cross." He didn't interrupt. He just sat there, listening. I continued, each word peeling away layers of burden I had carried for too long. "I'm not telling you this because I expect you to forgive me right away. I'm telling you because I don't want to live a lie anymore." Daniel lowered his head, his hands clasped tightly together. After a long silence, he looked up, his eyes red. "I made you feel alone. That's something I can't deny. But Harper, do you think we can find our way back to each other?"